Hello, hello, hello. And there we are. Welcome, everyone, to tonight's Explorer Series event. I'm so glad to see you all here. Some of you are familiar faces, some of you I haven't seen in a while, and also some fresh faces as well. Tonight's lecture is going to be When the Sun Strikes, How Space Weather Impacts Our High-Tech World. My name is Evan Portier, and I'm part of the Education, Engagement, and Early Career Development team here at NSF NCAR. NSF NCAR, or as we are known not by our acronym, the U.S. National Science Foundation, National Center for Atmospheric Research, that's why we say NSF NCAR, is a world-leading organization dedicated to understanding Earth system science, including our atmosphere, the sun, and the weather, and how all of these systems are important to building national resilience and helping protect our communities. Now, I have a couple of housekeeping things, and then we'll get to the presentation. For questions, we ask that you hold off questions until the end of the presentation. If you are joining us in person, you can just go ahead and raise your hand. I'll come around with a mic, and you can ask your question. If you are joining us virtually, you can scroll down on the Slido platform. You should see a green Join Event button. Go ahead and click that. If you already have clicked that button, you'll see a Q&A tab, which you can ask questions. We also have a few questions for you all in the audience, both in person and virtually. We'll be using the Slido platform. So you saw some notifications on this screen. If you haven't already, I'm going to ask folks to go ahead and navigate to slido.com. You can go ahead and punch in Explorer Series, and that will pop you up to the questions. And if not, you can go ahead and scan this QR code right here, and that will get you to the questions. So as folks are filling that out right now, I just want to remind you all that this event is being recorded and will be available on the Explorer Series website. So if you know any friends, family that weren't able to attend, you can go ahead and point them to our website. As you are filling out those questions, I'll go ahead and formally introduce our tonight's speakers. Tonight, we have Dr. Michael Wiltberger. He is the Deputy Director of the High Altitude Observatory at NSF NCAR. Amongst his many scientific accomplishments are pioneering work on the inclusion of ionospheric outflow and the application of advanced statistical analysis in global models. With him, we have Dr. Edward Oughton. He is an assistant professor at George Mason University, where he focuses on developing decision support models of critical infrastructure systems. This has including developing novel risk analysis methods of assessing societal vulnerability to space weather hazards. So with that, why don't we go ahead and give them a warm introduction. And I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to them, and we'll go ahead and put up our word cloud.
Space weather means to you and what the word cloud looks like. It's an active poll, and we're going to have something come up any minute now as I try to stretch this out. More people are participating. That's great. Hopefully that'll give us some number for our number of participants for the word cloud. But we'll see. Okay, there we go. It's interesting. Applied economics, impact on the atmosphere, the aurora, sunlight, solar flares, different kinds of variabilities, things that are coming into that. So that's a great starting point for us to dive in here today. If we could switch back to the presentation, that would be wonderful. So as they said, I'm Mike Wiltberger, and my colleague Ed Oughton and I are going to tag team this presentation. I'm going to do a little bit of the physics, and he's going to do a little bit of the asset and risk analysis and the economic impacts. Hopefully, you'll find it interesting and dynamic, and we'll jump right in. So the space weather term, there's weather in space. What's going on? What is this like? Maybe one of the first ways you see this is you're scrolling over on CNN.com and you see a site like this, that tonight's massive solar storm could disrupt the GPS and communication systems. And this is an actual screenshot from what CNN put out in May of last year, May 10th and 24th. There was a big event happening, and it got a lot of national, international attention. It popped up in the New York Times, lighting the skies with northern lights. If you're a person like me, you get a lot of questions from your relatives, like my niece Lauren saying, hey, is this going to be a good time for me to go see the aurora? And I get the opportunity to say, yes, you should go out and see the aurora. And that's a picture she took somewhere in Boulder, I believe, of the aurora on the 11th. And so my first pointer for space weather, when you see these things, start thinking about going outside and going to do the aurora, and turn on your cell phone camera. The image quality in your cell phone is amazing. And those purples and reds sometimes can be hard to see with the naked eye, but they'll really pop in your cell phone camera when you're doing that to go after that. So what I'm going to try to do is use the story of this event that happened in May 10, 11 of last year that we call the Gannon storm in memory of Jen Gannon, a Boulder scientist who passed away. And what it has in terms of impacts and whatnot on our technology. One of the things that you probably don't think about being impacted when you think about technology impacts is farming. Right? I mean, that's people out in the fields doing tractors and whatnot. Well, modern agriculture has become very dependent on technology. They want to get those seeds in exactly the right spot so they can get as much money, as much yield out of the ground to do that. So they're doing precision agriculture. And that ended up coming up on the New York Times that it was right in the middle of planting season. They want to get those things out there, and nope, the GPS isn't working. In fact, here's the screen grab that Terry Griffin, one of my colleagues on the Space Weather Advisory Committee, got from his local John Deere dealer, right? Friday, May 10th, update. We are seeing issues with GPS. No clue, right? An hour and a half later, they come up and they post an update. Oh, no, we think it's the space weather that's doing that. And this is the biggest storm, the worst storm we've seen since 2005. Stand by. You might try to turn this off, but it's probably not going to work. We'll keep you updated. And Terry's done some further great analysis. There are some really great tweets out there of farmers saying, well, I remember how to drive the tractor. I don't need the GPS to drive the tractor versus that. But it was hundreds of millions of dollars of economic impact from the delay of not being able to get out when they wanted to do it to get to that yield. So there are issues that come into play on that. So let's take it back and figure out where this is all coming from and what's driving that. And like most things in space weather, and probably most things on the Earth, it actually most times originates back from the sun. And so this is an image of the sun taken by a NASA satellite that's looking at the intensity coming out. And there's the blob that you see right here, when I'm circling there, the reddish color here and the thing there, that is a sunspot, a really active sunspot. If you're a familiar person with space weather, you may have heard of the famous Carrington event in 1889 that was a really big storm that disrupted the telegraphs at the time, the magnetometers out there, and that image is actually the hand-drawn image of what that sunspot structure looked like, roughly to the scale. So this is a pretty comparable size to this really big one that we on the space world, weather world, really were about. I mean, in fact, we can zoom in and see what it looks like. It's got complicated structures. It is massive interacting regions in coming into play. So it has the potential to be a really big origin of space weather events. In fact, that magnetic structure that you're seeing, we can zoom in on it and use an image that's called a magnetogram to tell us about that structure. And what you're seeing with the black and the white is the magnetic field intensity. So the black is the positive and the white is the negative. I think that's right. It doesn't really matter. One's coming in, one's coming out. And you can see how it's evolving and moving and twisting, because the sun is a hot boiling thing, and as stuff comes up and comes back down around, it's twisting and turning, taking all that magnetic field energy and winding it up. And once it gets wound up really tight, it's got to go somewhere and it releases. And we're going to see that in just a second on that there. But this is active region 3664, and it's going to track across the surface of the sun, evolve, and give us really great space weather origins. And so let's look at that in this next image. This is a composite view of the sun in different wavelengths that lets us look at the structure in the sun at different altitudes, different regions of it that are coming into play. I'm going to go back and try to get that to come play one more time. So you can see these loop-like structures that are coming in and out. That's the plasma aligned along the magnetic field. And then this guy right here in the middle, that is active region 36064, and it's evolving and coming across, twisting, and occasionally you see these bright flashes that are coming off of it. Those are solar flares. That's that twisted region getting released. And sometimes when that twisted region gets released, it's going to release a massive burst of plasma out into the plate region between the Earth and the sun. And so what we're looking at here is an instrument that we call a coronagraph. You can think of that as basically making a permanent eclipse, right? We're sticking something in there to block most of the light of the sun and then let us see the light that's scattering off the other stuff that's out there. And the bursts that you see coming out, those are the coronal mass ejections. That one that went just off that way, that one's going off the left. That one we don't have to worry about. It's going off into some other region of space. But the ones that are coming out, hopefully there'll be one in just a second, that kind of circle the whole sun. Right, that one was pretty close to it. They're coming directly at us. That's this big blob that we're seeing coming directly at us of the coronal mass ejection. There you go, there's another one coming out there. This active region sent off an incredibly large number of solar flares and CMEs. I believe it was order of 8 CMEs in the time frame it was transversing across the sun and heading towards us. Fun little factoid, the space weather community was actually engaged in doing a tabletop exercise to prepare the emergency preparedness systems and figure it out when this was going off. And there were people in the room at the beginning of the meeting that weren't there by day 2 because they had to go run off and actually start, plan, and deal with the response for what was going on in that scenario. So these big blobs of hot gas, the plasma, the coronal mass ejections, sometimes called CMEs, because we like to abbreviate things as scientists, because we're lazy and don't want to say that all the time, come flying through interplanetary space, and they're going to interact with the Earth's magnetic field and drive the changes that were defecting the GPS systems, the communication, and creating the aurora. And one way we look at that is by using instruments that we call magnetometers that we put on spacecraft. You could think of a magnetometer as a great big compass needle, right? And it's going to change the direction depending on which way the magnetic field is pointing. That's what those arrows are doing that you're seeing there. And the length of the arrow is going to tell us how strong it is. The view that you're seeing here is actually from data from the Gannon storm from the Iridium satellite network. So this is one of those early satellite cell phone networks that have magnetometers on them that they use mainly for engineering, but we've turned it into a science instrument to be able to get data out of that. And the view that you're looking at from here is actually looking down from the Earth, the top of the Earth, right? So we're sort of sitting over the pole and you're seeing that going on. The satellites are coming through there. You can see the variations in the magnetic field. And as we come along, the storm is going to pick in, and it'll be very obvious when that happens because all those little magnetic field lines are going to jump up and get really big and get really large because the magnetic field's perturbations are getting incredibly large. On the far right-hand side, the blue and the red that you're seeing there, that's turning that magnetic field instrument or measurement into being able to understand what the currents are. They actually are electric currents that are flowing from space down into the top of the ionosphere and closing across that. And right now, they're close to the magnetic pole. They're really not doing much as it goes on. But as the storm picks it up, those currents get more intense, and they also move to lower latitudes, which is why Lauren could see the aurora in Boulder, because it got pushed down to the lower latitudes for what was going on in that. As an aside, the Earth is not the only place that gets space weather. This is actually the navigation camera on the Curiosity rover that was on Mars at the time frame. And the wind that you see there is the terrestrial, well, not terrestrial, the Martian weather, right? The thing that caused the what's his name in the Martian book, that knocked his rocket over. I shouldn't have gone there. Anyway, that had caused him problems. That's the Martian weather. The white specks that you see popping up in this camera is actually the energetic particles flying down into the Martian space and hitting the camera and causing it to get really bright and pop into that. And so that's radiation hitting the camera from the space weather event as detected and observed on Mars from one of the later CMEs that went off that wasn't Earth-directed, but it was Martian-directed, which makes for an interesting challenge and an interesting thing as we start to think about going to the Moon to Mars initiative. We're gonna have to worry about space weather at Mars, start worrying about these things because we don't have the atmosphere there to protect the astronauts, and so we're gonna get into that risk as we go forward with it from there. So that's the background on space weather. I'm gonna turn it over to Ed for the first intro to the impacts.
Can you hear me all? Great, my mic's on. Wow, that was very energetic. I'm slightly worried I'm going to be the less energetic part of this comedy duo. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the impacts on critical infrastructure sectors, okay? And one of the main critical infrastructure sectors for which we see a lot of impacts is on the satellite sector. And there's really been a lot of changes that have taken place in the past 5 years, particularly in low Earth orbit with all the new satellites that have been launched into that part of space, near space. So there's 3 different types of potential impacts that you might see on satellites. So surface charging, for example, so all of this plasma is being thrown out from the sun, and it can basically stick to the spacecraft, and it can begin to actually build up an arc and cause some of the components there to actually fail, essentially. So that's not good if you want to sell some of these services which the satellites provide. Another major issue is satellite drag. So basically, as there's a disturbance to this space, the orbits actually, the satellites in orbit come closer to Earth. And that's a real problem because you need to stay on orbit. Okay, so you need to both get back to the orbit where you need to be, and you also need to make sure you're not actually colliding with another spacecraft while you veer off during this particular event. So some of the literature that we're seeing coming out, actually looking at the events that have taken place over the past couple of years, are indicating that there's no collision avoidance being taken place, none of the automated collision avoidance taking place during these major events. And this is all kind of new information, right? Because we haven't had so many assets in low Earth orbit until now, essentially, thousands of new satellites being launched, and we're really just figuring this out. You can also get single event effects, which is when there's radiation impacts on specific components, and that causes the satellites essentially to lose certain parts of their systems, and the engineers spend a vast amount of time trying to make sure that they build redundancy into these assets so that the satellites don't fail, so that you basically elongate their lifespan. There has been at least one startup I know of which has failed in the past couple of months due to loss of satellites, and that's hundreds of millions of dollars worth of losses. There was a pretty major event in 2022 when the SpaceX Starlink constellation was launching almost 50 satellites, and there was only a very minor space weather event, and they lost all of them. And there's been a whole load of literature which has been published over the past couple of years looking at this particular event just to emphasize that this is really kind of new territory for us. And there's a lot of these new startups, not necessarily SpaceX, but a lot of the new smaller startups especially are just using commercial off-the-shelf hardware to build these assets. They're not radiation hardened. They might not have been tested to a large extent. And it's only once you've launched those assets that you find out that maybe they don't survive in the environment that they're operating in. And it's a really challenging environment to operate in. Okay, so let's move on now to aviation. So within my research group, we're only just starting to look at aviation in a lot of depth, but there are a number of different impacts that can take place. So obviously to the avionics, potentially to the communication systems that support aviation services, and also potentially to the passengers and the crew who are going to get an increased radiation exposure dosage. So we've had a student over this summer, which I can show you, has been looking at some of the flight track data for the storms last year. So Seth Blumenthal, and he's been looking at the flight tracks before the May Gannon space weather event last year. So that's here, the control day is in blue. And this is for the Cathay Pacific flights going from Hong Kong to New York and Toronto. And then he's compared it to what happened on the solar weather days where we had a severe space weather event, and we see quite a divergence, basically, quite a divergence. So they're no longer taking that great circle route, which is basically the direct route. That means it takes longer to fly. That means it uses more fuel. We're kind of just working this out right now, but this is really interesting evidence to us. And we were just kind of hypothesizing that maybe they wanted to stay closer to where there might be emergency landing sites. Because it seemed that they went over Svalbard here, over Greenland. Perhaps they were just trying to be a little bit more risk-averse compared to their normal flight operations. But we're trying to quantify this in economic terms right now. And this is a really interesting kind of growing area of space weather awareness. Okay, so GPS-dependent activities. And I know Mike has already spoken at length about agriculture, but I just really wanted to put a picture of this tractor up on my presentation. So it's a really fantastic tractor. It's a bit of a monster. But obviously, all of those GPS-dependent activities may suffer disruption. And I think the key thing I'm going to highlight here, because this is about the extent of my farming knowledge, is that yellow egg yolk on top of the driver's cab is the GPS receiver. Mike gave a shout to Terry Griffin's work, which has been quantifying some of this. But, you know, precision agriculture requires sub-meter precision, basically. And he's looking at all of these yield losses, basically, because they want to know exactly where the seeds can be planted to minimize agricultural fertilizer use, things like this, optimize cost. And they just weren't able to do that when there's disruption to the navigation systems. Okay, so I'm going to talk at length in this presentation about the power grid impacts, but I just want to summarize using a impact tree produced by Mike Hapgood, one of my co-authors, about the different impacts on all of these technology systems. So it's just going to summarize what I essentially have been talking about. So Mike emphasized that there are these coronal mass ejections, so billions of tons of plasma being thrown out of the sun, and they're usually, the largest ones are usually always accompanied by other space weather phenomena. Okay, so solar electromagnetic bursts here, these can cause radio blackouts for some of these systems, high-frequency comms, for example. When we see a coronal mass ejection interacting with Earth's geospace, we also see a magnetic storm, and here we see the impacts potentially on power grids, again on the communication systems here, which are linked to aviation, the green boxes, and then also impacts on satellite operations. Here's a spacecraft charging, spacecraft drag. And finally, you can also see radiation storms, and these can affect all of these different systems in aviation, in satellite. And so it's quite a large number of different impacts. And really, most of the focus over the past 10 or 20 years has generally been on power grids, maybe a bit on satellite. Aviation, we're really just starting out on right now. GPS, there's probably one or two people who focus on the GPS disruptions, so really only very kind of minorly researched. Okay, so I'm going to get into the power grid part now, where we'll actually show some of the results that we've been generating. Mike was making fun of me because I'm the kind of risk analyst, economist who's going to explain some of the physics principles behind this. But some of you might remember that, from school, Faraday's law suggests that an alternating magnetic field generates a current in an inductor. And the reason why I wanted to highlight this is when we see geomagnetically induced currents, which are what cause problems to the power grids, we're essentially seeing this play out at a planetary scale, okay? So we use this to power our homes, power our businesses, but when this happens with space weather, those currents have to flow somewhere, okay? So this diagram is just basically emphasizing that we have a power grid. So for anyone who's not familiar, we generally generate electricity in places where maybe we don't live. Maybe it's a favorable place to generate that electricity. And then we need to move it along a transmission network to places where people actually consume that electricity. That's probably largely where the cities and all the industry is. We need to move it up to a higher voltage to get it into the transmission network to reduce power losses. And this is generally where the largest problems accrue. So in areas where there's very resistive rocks, very resistive ground rocks, when those geomagnetically induced currents are produced, they can't flow down into the earth. They follow the path of least resistance, and they flow into the power grid. And when that happens, it can add additional current onto the sensitive components, which we see here at the transformers, which are basically the very sophisticated assets that help us move this power up and down voltages. So what does that mean? These things here are the assets that we're particularly worried about. okay? So it's really a triumph of human civilization that we've been able to produce these systems. Okay, you put it in the same box as the internet and all the other amazing things that we've been able to do. But they're highly complicated, expensive, heavy, hard to produce. People are very worried if we lose a large number of these in one go, it would be very hard to replace. And actually, we have some evidence down here. So this is from the JPM nuclear transformer in Pennsylvania from the 1989 storm, which is when there was a very large event. And it burnt away the windings and some of the insulation. And from down here, you can see this picture taken by Trevor Gorn, one of our co-authors on the work that we produced. And this was from the 2003 storm. He was working for the South African electricity transmission operator, Eskom, at the time. And what you often find about the people who work in the operational side of this is that they kind of hang around in space weather for a very long time because they like the intellectual challenge of trying to work out how to deal with these threats because there's so much unknown, okay? So these are the assets which potentially we lose, and we have to move them into place. They're very large, so you need a Goldhofer to move them. You can't move them over bridges because they weigh too much. You can't move them under bridges, often because they're too large. So you have these issues, logistical issues, with trying to move a large number of these around. In business as usual conditions, our power grid operators say it takes 2 to 3 years to order one and get it into place. So if we lost a large number of these in one go, people are very concerned about how we would potentially replace these assets. Okay, so why do we care? Well, traditionally, we had an energy system that just supported all the other critical infrastructure sectors. The reality is, since the production of the internet is now, we have this huge interconnected web that supports everything that we do on an hourly basis, power, connecting to the internet, cell phones, it's all interconnected. So you lose parts of this network and the whole thing collapses, it cascades. And what we've been trying to do in our work is to actually model this. Okay, so why do we care about this? How does it play out if there's actually a power outage? Well, essentially, if we were to lose power, okay, there would be an area that would be without this, and the businesses present in those areas would be part of a supply chain, okay? And here we have a domestic supply chain. So on the left-hand side, business 1 can't sell its goods or services to business 2. Business 2 can't sell its goods or services to business 3. Okay, and we have the same problem with international supply chains as well. So the work that we've produced quantifies this. So the direct impact in the supply chain area, the direct impact in the outage area, and then the potential cascading impacts on the supply chains. Okay, great. I'll hand back to Mike. Thank you.
The handoff. Good job. Intellectually stimulating and energetic portion of the talk, which is now going to try to transition into the modeling on the side of the physics of what's going on in the system itself. And we're going to come closer to Earth and talk about the model of what we call geospace, the near-Earth space environment. So that's sort of the upper levels of our atmosphere up to where the atmosphere goes away. Actually, the sunlight coming in there ionizes, and so we get charged particle separation in there, so we call that layer the ionosphere. And then it extends out into the space beyond the orbit of the moon and out into interplanetary space. The image that you're seeing here is generated from the multi-scale atmosphere geospace environment model, MAGE. And yes, we came up with MAGE first and then turned it into an acronym to be able to be geeky kind of people that we are. And that covering from actually the surface of the Earth up to 2 million kilometers altitude, out past the orbit of the moon. The field lines, the blue, the white, the green lines that you're seeing there, they're actually what we call magnetic field lines. And so when they're close to the Earth, that you kind of get the perspective that they're coming into the Earth, right? There's a dipole in the center of the Earth, a bar magnet. Not really, but that's what you can think about it as the analogy. And so there are field lines coming out of the southern hemisphere and going into the northern hemisphere. And when I mentioned those coronal mass ejections coming from the sun, they're actually carrying with it the magnetic field that was embedded in it from its origin region in the sun. And that solar wind, the white lines that you see out there, has a particular direction. And if that direction, here we go with the fancy hand maneuvers, is opposite to the direction of the magnetic field coming from the Earth, they come together and we get a process called magnetic reconnection. And that creates those green lines, right? So the Earth, the line that would have normally been coming and connecting connecting back to the Earth has gotten interacted with the sun, and now it's connecting back out into the solar wind. And that's a mechanism that allows us to put energy and momentum and plasma into the magnetosphere that wouldn't have been able to get into it before. And that drives activity along the flank. You can see the little like eddies along that edge region, and then deposition of energy into the region behind the Earth that we call the magnetotail. And when we get that energy coming in there, we get all sorts of little flow structures that are coming in that you can see with the reds and highlighted regions that come into there. And that interaction is going to create bright spots in the aurora, bright spots into the current, variation in the drivers that are going to affect the communication systems and the power grid. The last piece of the model that we're dealing with is actually in the inset over on the right-hand side there. That is our expanded view of the Earth's atmosphere. So the Earth is in the center there, and then we've sort of exaggerated the scale so that you can see what's going on. That's covering from 100 to 400 kilometers. So it's blown up in size so you can see the variation that's coming in there. And that's the density of the plasma in the thermosphere that's coming into play. And it's got a lot of structure, it's got a lot of variation in it. And all that energy, all that process that we had coming in the magnetotail is going to get ending up being deposited into the ionosphere atmosphere system, create new structures in it, heat it up. As it heats up, it expands. It's going up to higher altitudes. That means that the satellite that you had put into low Earth orbit that you thought wasn't going to be running into the atmosphere is now running into the atmosphere, so it's got satellite drag. So we need to be able to understand the variations that are going to come on into that space. So we at NSF NCAR are part of a collaboration with a number of universities led by Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Labs to do what we call the Center for Geospace Storms. So CGS, or the Center for Geospace Storms, the people that are producing this model in collaboration with us. And what I'm going to show you in the next few slides are some modeling results from the Gannon storm, that we took the observations from the solar wind, what was present in that coronal mass ejection, used it as the boundary conditions for the simulation, and let it go. And when you get to work with folks at NASA, sometimes they let you talk to the scientific visualization studio. And so this turns the numbers and bits into a prediction of what the system was going to be like. You can see the variation in the magnetic field lines, the orientation, that's the change in the solar wind magnetic field that's going on. That green structure there is the compression of the hard blowing solar wind that's pushing that whole magnetic field in closer on the day side, stretching it out on the night side, the intensity that's coming on. The little blue streaks that you see kind of in that behind the Earth, the magnetotail region, are trying to let you see what the dynamics of that flow is like. They started at a particular point and they're coming in, and you can see the variation of the structure that's going on. And just for reference, we're now kind of behind the Earth on the left-hand side, and the sun is way, way off on the right-hand side as we zoom back in and get that view of this compressed region of the Earth's magnetosphere with a much heated atmosphere that's higher in altitude than we had previously expected it to be. So that is why I get to stand up here and do the really cool pictures, because there's a lot of math behind that, but it looks really cool. So that the exciting visualization kind of things. We then take that model output and try to use it to make predictions for the geomagnetically induced currents that we're talking about. What you're looking at here is a map of the US transmission power grid, right? So the big blue lines are the power lines that are moving it from the generation to the spots where we want to use it. And what's going on, the color changes that you're seeing there are actually our estimation of what the induced current is, the change from the storm in the power grid as the variation is happening in the intensity of the geomagnetic storm. And as we get closer to the peak here, you're seeing a lot more of the blue or the orange colors coming into the Midwest region. If you look closely on the East Coast, you'll see some of that coming up in the variation as we come into play. And it should, theoretically, if I did this right, stop at the last moment of it, and I should be able to see the intensity of the Minnesota Midwest region, where there's that really old rock that's really hard for the currents to flow through, and there's some more of that structure. There we go, yeah, so you see the brightness popping up in that sector, and then also some portion of that showing up in the Northeast New York, New England kind of corridor there. So I'll ask you to remember that portion of stuff as Ed picks it up and does some of the more economic impact modeling.
Thanks, Mike. Great. Can you hear me okay? Is my mic on? Great. Jeffrey Love came today, which was great. He worked with Greg Lucas on some of this original work. And when I came 2 years ago, I sat down with Greg and I had coffee and I said, what's the state of play? I had read his work and he'd basically said, this is where we got to, which was analyzing the current on the lines, but where we don't have any information is the nodes in the network, the substations. Okay, and that's essentially where I'm going to kind of pick this up and talk about how we went off and collected a lot of this data. So as you know, we generate the electricity at certain locations, and we have to move it to where people are going to consume that electricity, and that means we need to have some sort of model of the electricity transmission network, the power grid. Okay. Now, at these particular parts of the power grid, the substations, we have these transformers. We don't know really how many there are, and that's why we went off and we started collecting data on this. Okay, so this is part of a web application which we built. So my PhD student, Dennis Bohr, is sat here, who built a lot of it. Essentially, it takes satellite imagery from Google APIs, and basically for the substations, it allows a user to click on the assets and to actually categorize them: transformers, static var compensators, different parts of the electricity substation. Okay, and we did this for 1,400 substations. So it's not possible that we kind of drive to each one and manually survey them. So building this web interface meant that we were able to collect some really nice data to feed into our model, essentially. And Dennis, this is the interface which he built. He allowed you to use Google Street View basically to validate that you've tagged these assets correctly, these transformer assets. And then we're able to take that and start to do cool things with it in the work that we produced. So the coupled model that we produced, which takes kind of the physics models, they talk to this engineering model, and then we're able to estimate areas which are vulnerable. And from the work that we produced, you can see the substations where we think there are likely to potentially be the largest issues. Again, highlighting some of those areas that were in the graphic which Mike presented, so around the Minnesota region and the northeastern part of the US, so from Maine down the eastern seaboard down to Virginia, basically. And that's all wonderful, really high-resolution data, and we haven't really sliced and diced that in all the ways that we could do yet. So this is kind of ongoing research, but we've got some great initial papers out based on that model coupling. Okay, so I'm going to present to you some of the impact estimates, all right? Now, traditionally, people didn't really do it this way. We coupled the models together to try to reduce some of that uncertainty. Before, people would just kind of pick numbers and throw them into an economic model and produce some estimates of the potential gross domestic product losses. We think we've done a better job than that, basically, by doing this model coupling process. Okay, so from the results that we've got, here we've got the return period on the x-axis, and we've got the magnitude of the impacts on the y-axis. So risk equals probability of an event happening times the severity. So these are kind of nice risk metrics that we've produced. And here we're looking at the number of business establishments that might be affected based on the return periods that we assessed. So about 40,000 to 160,000 businesses potentially due to these thermal heating effects from certain space weather events. And from those same areas, it equates to about 1.5 to 6 million people who could be directly affected, okay? We think that this is really nice because we've got the quantified standard error. So this is the uncertainty part. All models are wrong. Some models are useful. There's a lot of parameters that we feed into our models that we just don't have real values for. So we try to use some techniques to basically try to capture some of this uncertainty. Okay, big numbers on the economic impacts. So the direct economic losses, they're the people who are in the power outage area. Okay, and we quantify these in terms of gross domestic product, so that's the lost value in the economy. We're finding about $0.25 to $1.25 billion worth of losses per day, okay? We don't really look at the temporal restoration period, we just say, what would the daily loss be? And these are the numbers that we essentially come out to. The total economic loss, so this includes all of those supply chain impacts, the indirect supply chain impacts, and we're seeing about $0.5 to $2 billion worth of losses to the economy per day. So these are quite large numbers overall, but we think that this is a nice step forward based on where the current state of the art is in this area. Okay, so we can also break these down in economist speak based on the industrial sector. Okay, so traditionally you can categorize economies into agriculture, manufacturing, services. Here we've broken it down into more sectors, but essentially we quantify those losses based on the direct supply chain impacts and the indirect supply chain impacts. What I'll note, as you'll see that finance and professional services are really badly hit, is anytime you start to hit New York, because it's quite high latitude, these are the sectors which come out with the largest losses, okay? The other thing I'll just highlight here is if you look at manufacturing, there's actually an indirect loss, which is more than 60% of the loss. And if you think you're trying to produce an automobile, a truck, how many times those components get passed around different companies, small shocks to areas in the manufacturing supply chain cause lots of cascading effects. So it's like when you throw a stone into a pond, you see the ripples from that stone. This happens through the economy. Okay, so I'm going to close by saying why it's challenging to make space weather a predictive science. And that's because we have to basically grapple with these effects taking place on the sun, passing through the interplanetary medium, and then affecting geospace. So all the stuff that Mike's working on and very eloquently presented to us earlier. Then we need to basically do the stuff that Jeffrey does. So we need to basically go from the magnetic field through to the geoelectric field. Then we need to feed it into power grid models, which is usually the domain of electrical engineers. And we've worked with a lot of those electrical engineers to try to do this in a more rigorous way. Then basically we need to be able to model the decisions that the operators actually take, because that has a big impact on the outcome. And then we need to produce the types of metrics that policymakers and businesses care about, which often is these kind of economic impact metrics. So that's a real challenge. And you might not believe me, but terrestrial weather forecasting is actually quite good. And we're a few years behind in space weather, but we've been making strides to try to close this chain so we can move this towards more of a predictive science. So I'm going to close on a positive note before I hand it back to Mike, and that's that a lot of good work has happened in the power grid sector in terms of increasing resilience, okay, compared to where we were 10 or 20 years ago. So I've been working with Transpower in New Zealand, and this is a quote from their engineers, basically, but they were saying that thanks to the work that they've done on the modeling side, the space weather, and then looking at the impacts in their grid, they were basically able to halve the exposure that was present within their grid due to geomagnetically induced currents. So from approximately 103 amps is what they actually saw. But if they hadn't have made any of the switching sequences that came out of the R&D investment in space weather, it would have been double that. So I think that that's a really positive thing. And next, hopefully we can do the same for the satellite sector.
Thanks. Yeah, so the one sector that we wanted to kind of close on here was where are the risks growing, and where are we thinking about things in the future? So this graph is showing you in the orange color the sunspot cycle. So we didn't really talk about this, but the sun actually has a cycle that goes through every 11 years. The number of sunspots increases and then it decreases and kind of goes on a roughly 11-year cycle. So there was a peak around 1980, a peak around 1990, et cetera, et cetera. And we're actually approaching solar maximum. When we're at solar maximum, the sun's magnetic field is more complicated, and you have more of these chances for these complicated sunspot structures to come into play, and that's the big red dot at the end. There is the Gannon storm, that major impact that comes into play. There was the big one that we were talking about in 1989 that had some power effect impacts, and then the so-called Halloween storm that happened around Halloween in 2003 near the solar maximum, but not always. The 89 one was actually in a solar minimum. You can get complicated structures at any point in time in the solar cycle, so the risk is there. The other piece of information that's on this graph here is these little bars, gray bars that are kind of going across there. They're sort of floating around, I don't know, 50 or so from 1970 to roughly 2020 or so. And that's the number of payload launches per year, right? So that's how much stuff are we putting up there, right? You got the Apollo spacecrafts back here in the late 60s or before the 70s, and then we got a fairly constant rate of putting stuff up so we can have communications satellites and weather satellites and whatnot, but there really isn't much going on there because it was expensive to build a rocket, to put something up there and get it to stay up there and last. So there was only certain governments, large things that could do that. And then we get into the late 2010s and into the 2020 timeframe, and SpaceX comes along, Blue Origin comes along, other people kind of get at it. It becomes more economically viable, more economically able for the launch to happen. And we get the miniaturization revolution that's going on. So we're building what we have, called CubeSats, and they're literally this big. You can hold it in your hand, and they're launching satellites that can do the communications, do the observations. So what you see is this exponential growth in the number of satellites that are going up, and they're going up into the low Earth orbit area because that's the cheapest spot to put them in at the moment, and you can do good stuff from there. So we're in a brave new world of having a massive number of satellites up in this region in a time frame where most of those providers that were coming into play never saw a major geomagnetic storm, never had to deal with that kind of thing, maybe didn't even think about it in their engineering space. But as we go forward into this, it's gonna have to happen. And when you have that many payloads that are up there, you can't have John Doe air traffic controller or space traffic controller saying, oh, you need to get your satellite out of the way. It's gotta happen automatically, it's gotta happen autonomously, and you need good modeling, good information in there to be able to make that thing happen. And that's where we're trying to go. That's where I see the frontier is in the space weather prediction capability space. And Ed's student, I'm not going to get this name right. Save me, Ed. Thank you. Went and looked at the International Telecommunication Union data of basically the licenses for putting up launches for upcoming things into space. And there are over 500,000 satellites planned or live launched that are going in there. Some constellations, the Starlink there, really massive numbers of licensings that are coming into play. Will all of these satellites get launched? Maybe, maybe not, but there's gonna be a large number of new satellites up there that presents a new challenge for us in the space weather modeling community to help mitigate that risk and help us understand so that we can use our cell phone and get from location A to B and talk to the people that we wanna talk to. So with that, we will go into the question and answer portion of the evening. I will go sit down next to Ed, and Evan will run the microphone around, and we'll be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Awesome. Good job.
We'll be doing questions from the in-person audience, and also online we'll alternate. So does anyone have any questions in our in-person audience for Ed and Mike? Yeah.
One of the last things you said was, we tell the people, you got to move your satellite. Is that the solution?
So telling people that we're going to move the satellite is probably not the solution, but having autonomous networks that are able to make those decisions independently. But in order for them to be able to do that, they need to know where they are, and they need to know where people are going to end up being. And that depends a lot on the environment that they're in. And so when a big geomagnetic storm comes in, a lot of those principles and capabilities get scrambled, and that makes it harder for the autonomous systems to make that decision.
Excellent. It looks like we have some online questions here. We're going to go ahead and highlight one of them in a second. We'll give Ed and Mike some time to look at those questions. How is space engineering preparing for extreme space weather events like CMEs, coronal mass ejections? What challenges remain to protect satellites and infrastructure during geomagnetic storms?
So I'll take a first crack, and then you can jump in and go on it from there. So extreme space weather events is the really big obstacle that we have to look at there, because we don't have a lot of them in our data sets. And so that's where we're trying to get the models to be able to handle what's coming out for an extreme event, to give some bounding information for it, so that the people that are building a satellite know what intensity of radiation they're going to experience, so they know how much money to spend on shielding, right? it's not this way, but you can think about it. You can put a bunch of lead on there, right, to block the X-rays that are going to come on there. But lead's heavy, and you don't want to put a lot of lead on your satellite because it costs money to launch it up there. I mean, that's the simplified version of it, but that's the engineering question that you need. How much money do I need to invest into hardening my satellite to be able to make it last as long as I want? In order to do that, I need to know what that environment's going to be like, and that's where we're going after it from that perspective. We talked extensively about the drag network side of things. The power grid folks are starting to get a handle on the resilience, although the extreme event risk I think is still real and still understanding what's going on to it from that perspective. Anything you'd like to add?
I think there's a large trend away from old space, which was where you would build a very large, expensive satellite and it would be very rigorously protected and you would launch it, to new space where you just make lots of them. And basically, you're not investing a massive amount in protection each one. You're hoping that you get resilience by having more redundancy, essentially. So this is the big change. And I think that's the real thing that we're seeing right now that's changing that, again, as a non-space engineer.
No, I completely agree with what you're saying there, Ed, and I think that actually is the new piece of the risk equation that's coming in, right? You're not spending a lot of money to make it harden, so you're launching a lot of them up there, but then you've got a lot of stuff up there that you got to worry about the space traffic management of the coordination of all of those pieces. That's the new risk, the new environment that comes into play with doing that approach.
Yeah, so I should plug some of Dennis's research. He looked at the SpaceX Starlink constellation, and it was only after we removed like 1,000 of the 6,000 satellites that you started to see any degradation in the service provided to the users of the service, basically. So there's a hell of a lot of redundancy in those new mega constellations.
Questions from our audience?
Yeah, I have a question. I'm hearing the word national mentioned a lot and the word money mentioned a lot. So how concerned should we be that any of the funding will be pulled that will affect so many people throughout the world?
Yeah, so I mean, there are a lot of information and assets that are being provided by NASA, by NOAA to monitor and provide that information, to provide that insight. There's a lot of money being invested right now in the basic research that I'm doing to try to provide that insight to get into build the model so that they can get the most economic value out of it there. So there's a lot of return on that investment there. What I think you're also seeing is the possibility of it moving away from just being the nation state actors that are able to do launches, right? You now have private companies and smaller nations that are able to make these launches because of the changes in the cost scales that come into play there. But they're going to need good information and good insights about what the space weather environment is like to be able to operate cost effectively and safely.
Kind of jumping on a little bit of that note, Ed, I know a lot of the graphs that you showed in the models were domestic, and I just want to get a sense, is there a lot of international interest in some of this work that you're doing? Because you mentioned kind of the global supply chain where some of these outages can affect, outside of our nation.
Thanks. So yeah, I would say there is. What we've developed here is a really kind of state-of-the-art capability. So we've had requests from other governments around the world, like New Zealand, saying, can you come and assess our country? So that's been a really great thing to look at and to see how the nuance of each system plays out, basically. So hopefully looking forward to doing a few more of those over the coming years.
That international connection is kind of fun for us as on the science side, because New Zealand is relatively low latitude on the other side of the Earth, so it's got more risk, more exposure coming into play. But it's a relatively small country, so they've got like one power grid operator, so it's easier for us to handle that communication and deal with that. It makes for an exciting data set for us to do comparisons with and try to look at.
Yeah, it's a really good example of collaboration between university researchers, the power grid engineers, and just sharing of data, basically, something which we struggle with here.
Do we have an online question? We're going to go ahead and highlight that. Do your GDP loss and number of people impacted calculations assume substation total failure/blackout, or just partial damage to transformers?
So we assume a relatively simplistic total failure, but that's just because the focus of our project has been on trying to couple together these different modeling approaches. We could slice and dice this into lots of different research questions. We could look at the restoration, we could calculate the losses on the transformers. Really, to be honest, we have a big weakness in terms of how we model the transformers, just because we don't really have actually good models of some of these designs yet. There's a lot of proprietary information that's obviously just not shared, and that's an area of future research for us, where we're actively trying to fund some of that work moving forward to reduce the uncertainty.
There a question from the audience?
Yeah, I think this was part of the previous question, is that given that science does not seem to be popular in the funding arena these days, and we do know that NSF has had a lot of cuts, I'm wondering how that has already affected what you're planning to do and what you think the rest of the international community can pick up where we have to pull back.
Thanks. I think, obviously, that's a hard question to answer, but the immediate one is that we will just be writing more proposals to get a successful grant. So yeah, success rates will decrease. We have actively been trying to seek, foundation support, charitable support for some of this research, but there's only so much that sector can do. So, the long term might be that we just have fewer grad students, sadly.
We have another online question. What role does the Space Weather Center at NOAA Labs in Boulder perform?
Yeah, so it's actually called the Space Weather Prediction Center, or SWPSE, as we lazy scientists like to call it, and that is part of NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and it's actually buried within the National Weather Service. And you can think of SWPSE as the equivalent of the National Hurricane Center. So when there's a big hurricane coming on, the Hurricane Center gears up all their models. They give you the little plots of where it's going to go, and they tell the people in Miami to duck, or the people in New Orleans to duck, and what they need to do on that set. SWPSE is playing exactly that same type of role for a space weather event. So when the Gannon storm was happening and those folks were in their tabletop exercise and they said, oh, nope, we got to come back. We got to start cranking up the models. We got to start on sending out our alerts and warnings, trying to understand what's going to happen when the impacts are coming in. It's providing that information about the severity of the storms, which areas are being impacted, and how much longer we want it to be going after. So they're the front line of the forecast information, of the providing the information to the United States, and actually one of the leading places for doing that in the world.
Questions from the audience? Yeah.
I could ask this question tomorrow in your office, but
No, please, go ahead, come back.
let's consider a hypothetical scenario. If something is happening there on the sun and it will come towards Earth in 2-3 days, what should your thought in current scenario that this should strike our Earth, so that the people sitting there who are cutting our money should realize this is important, or it should pass the Earth sideways so that our whole system will be safe?
So I think you're asking a little bit about the needs for getting the information for when is it going to come and is it going to actually hit us. And so that's an observing question, right? We need to have good observations of the sun to be able to see the CMEs and the solar flares that are occurring that's sending that information out. And then we need to have a good infrastructure in place to be able to model and understand what those impacts are going to be. And we want to be realistic in that, right? We don't want to be Chicken Little and saying, the world's going to fall down, and then the world doesn't fall down. So we want to bound what we're saying, and I think there was a lot of messaging around that related to the Gannon storm. We thought it was going to be potentially significant. People should take precautionary steps, like you should for any major impending challenge, hurricane threat, like let's call it a threat. They do reasonable precautions and see where it goes from there. And so having that information, being able to provide that insight, requires the investments in the observing and technological systems that we have in place today. Anything you want to add? No. Okay.
Do we have another online question? Does your work cross over with the DoD's effort to harden systems from EMP, electromagnetic pulses?
Okay, so let's do some acronym explanation here. So DoD is the Department of Defense, right? The United States military side of things, and EMP, electromagnetic pulse, is one of the things that happens when you detonate a nuclear bomb at high altitude. You actually create plasma, and it creates an electromagnetic wave, and that wave can go out and knock out power grids, knock out your chips in your cell phone and those kinds of things. There is a similarity of the initial phase of the geomagnetic storm impulse that looks similar to what happens in an electromagnetic pulse scenario. The other thing that we think about here is in the risk environment or the preparedness environment is an all hazard kind of thing. Steps that you can take to protect yourself, protect the grid and the network from a geomagnetic event translate to reducing risk and protecting the system from an electromagnetic pulse kind of risk. Do Ed and I do that kind of research? I don't have a security clearance. I don't think he has a security clearance. So no, we don't get to do much in the DoD space getting into it there. But that's sort of my layman understanding of where that is and where the crossover is in that space.
I'll just add that, yeah, we have a PhD working on EMP in our research group, the Space Weather Lab at GMU, and she's a government employee, so she has access to the actual signature and the classified stuff, but she works and sits with the space weather folks, so she can understand the physics, and then she goes off and applies it in her day job, basically.
Questions from the audience? Yeah, we'll go right over here.
How long do these storms last? Are we talking about a day, a half a year, instantaneous?
Yeah, so that's probably something I should have said in my talk and explained the duration of. So thanks for asking that question. It varies. It can do that, but usually it's 1 to 2 days for the whole geomagnetic storm interval to happen. The initial portion of it, the really intense thing, can happen on sort of the hour time scale that's coming into play. And during that 1 to 2 day period, there's a fair amount of variability that comes into play. So you can see the rotor brighten up, then it comes down for a little bit, then it goes back down, and that variation is on the couple of hour kind of time scale. So, but generally speaking, couple days for the whole thing to happen with variations on the hour time scale within it. Does that answer what you wanted to know?
Yeah.
Perfect.
And just to follow up on that, one of the notes is that you've used kind of these extreme solar events and also solar storms. And I'm wondering, those are not synonymous. Like it seemed like some of the solar storms happened on intervals like 10 years on that one of the last graphs that you showed.
Yeah.
Some of the models that you did were between like 150 to 250 years.
Right. Yeah. So I'll let Ed jump in here. But what we were sort of saying is that was we only have this record of the time frame of when we were making observations sort of in the space age to be able to get a little bit of that information out there. And we're seeing big, major geomagnetic storms roughly every decade or so. But the really big things are rarer than that, and that gets into his model on the time scales. And I'll let Ed jump into it from there.
Space weather is a high impact, low frequency threat. So we look at the most extreme storms that happen over longer time periods, basically.
The last really, really big one that we think about having impacted the Earth was the one I mentioned earlier on in my thing of the Carrington storm. 1689, help me out.
1859.
1859. See, I should never try to do dates because I'm tired. But so several hundred years ago, kind of time scale that comes into play. Interestingly, from a modeling perspective, the sun is producing things like that maybe a bit more frequently, but they have to be directed at the Earth for us to sort of care about it in space. And NASA launched a really clever mission that they called Stereo, which had one orbit that was slightly inside of the Earth, so it was going faster, and one orbit that was slightly outside of the Earth, so it was going slowly. So they precessed around so you could get a stereoscopic view of the sun to get, looking at it from two different sides. And one of those satellites was sitting over on the side when a really big CME came off and hit that satellite. And so that's given us our first sort of modern observations of what may have been present in an event like that. And that's one of the things that we use to try to drive the modelings for extreme conditions is that observation there. So
What happened to that satellite?
It was designed to be out there in space and hardened to do those things. And to my best of my knowledge, it's still operating fine. It's stereo and doing its thing, but it's designed to sit out there and make those kind of observations. So it's okay.
Awesome. Do we have another online question? We'll go ahead and get that highlighted. Is there bad weather or simply inadequate clothing and preparation?
Well, the problem here is what we know and based on scientific knowledge. So we haven't really seen like the big event during the space age, and we're so dependent on all of these space-borne technologies. So we can only really accurately say, what to prepare for based on what we've seen recently over the past few decades. So it's hard to say that, I think.
Yeah, I take the point about being, having your raincoat and your umbrella ready to go when you're going out in that kind of time frame, and that may not make the weather bad because you're prepared for it. But at the same point in time, if you were trying to have your wedding like I was, and then there was a massive storm that came in and your guests couldn't get there, that's still bad weather from that perspective. So there is a balance even from the risk and preparation side to what you're trying to do that may not be able to be moved around those kinds of things. So it's a balance in that space.
Ending on a positive note, I mean, just awareness of space weather helps a lot. And that's the big change that's happened in the past 10 or 20 years.
Well, we'll get a couple more questions from the audience.
Okay, so speaking of like preparation and whatever, is it possible to like put the transformers on like big concrete slabs so they're like not on the bedrock anymore? That seems like not so hard.
So some of the transformers are earth to the ground, and that's how the GIC flows into them. But again, I'm not an electrical engineer, so this is a challenging question for me. But the power operators are worrying about this to a great extent, and I've worked with a few of them, and I know that they do move their old transformers to substations where they see specific vulnerability, so they've got redundancy basically. But there's a whole range of different options that they can take to try to harden their grid.
There are other things that they can take to do things, making sure that there are alternative power generation capabilities ready to be spun up, deferring routine maintenance so that you're not taking power systems offline when you're at a higher risk, and then there are the current blocker kind of concepts that come into play, but those cost money, right? And so it's that balance of how much money do you need to spend versus the risk that you're going to come into play, which is where the information from Ed is so important.
So the three options we tested in New Zealand were the grid resequencing, islanding specific areas, and then blocking strategies, so installing GIC blockers at specific substations. And we did the cost-benefit analytics for those different strategies. Good question. I think that we were looking at, depending on the substation, it was like $1 to $2 million basically to install a GIC blocker. Yeah. No, and I think they decided it was $500,000 to work out the grid resequencing. Yeah, which is like peanuts, but yeah.
It's pretty astronomical there. We'll get a couple more questions from the audience here.
You guys did a very nice job of showing us the impact of the sun on infrastructure of the power and communications. I wonder in a broader sense, what the sun's effect on what we call climate change is, and can you speak to that portion of some other source of economic concern?
I'm not sure how to answer that, but I know that the climate models don't account for the sun's effect, if that was
the variability of the sun and the input of the climate models, as I understand it, because I'm also not a climate scientist, is not huge. It's not one of the biggest changes of the drivers that come into play for what we're doing there. The sun's fairly constant. The light that's coming off, the input that's coming into play. There isn't really a lot of variability that is in there. Actually, we can see in the space environment the impacts of human-driven climate change and the changes that are occurring in the ionosphere, thermosphere, and we can look at the impacts of that and make that noticeable observation in the ionosphere. This is the other way around. Yeah.
This is a shameless plug for our other research, but the methods which we presented today, can be applied to space weather, but we also apply them to climate hazards, and we've done a lot of work on that in the last few years, and the papers are almost about to be out on that. So we've tried to look at it, but we aren't getting to the point where we're working with the actual climate models. We're quite far downstream from there.
Excellent. And I think to close it out, I just have one question for you both, is just that if folks either viewing online or in the audience are really interested in this type of work, Do you have any advice or suggestions to get in this line of work?
Go to college and get a degree. I'm not sure. I'm not sure how to answer that. There are some nice resources for education on the NCAR education pages that talk about space weather and the aurora and what the science is on it from that side. The Space Weather Prediction Center has a whole suite of pages on preparedness and what are the impacts and what's the terminology that comes into play. And if you really want to know more about it, I didn't put the emails on there. Go Google me and send me an email, and I'll be happy to answer questions that way.
So at GMU in the College of Science, we have the Aspiring Scientists Summer Internship Program, and we take a lot of high school students who want to come in and work on this topic. So there are internship options available for people who are really interested in working on space weather and critical infrastructure.
See, that's why it's good to work for a professor. They have better answers.
Awesome. Well, let's go ahead and give them a round of applause. Hold on.
Thank you. Thank you. You've been a wonderful audience.
And before you all leave, I have a couple of more housekeeping things, so bear with me. Thank you all again for attending this event. We really appreciate it. We have a couple of events that are actually happening outside of the Mesa Lab, so the next 2 months. In August, we'll have basically a whole month of kind of on weather. So the first one will be at Bambi Brewing from 7 to 8 p.m. on August 12th, related to severe weather in our national parks. So that should be really interesting. And then on the 23rd, we're going to have a talk about community weather models, what they do and why they're useful. And so that's going to be at the North Boulder or NOBO Library, and that's on a Saturday from 3 to 4:30. You can find out more information about these events on our website. And in September and October, we'll also be going out to the Fraser Meadow community and hosting an eclipse talk at, there. Not to be left behind, for our online audience, we hope to see you again on October 1st here at the Mesa Lab at 7 p.m. for a special event where we'll talk about our NSF NCAR field campaigns, where we take out our research aircraft to study the atmosphere. If you're still interested in more Explorer Series events, please, again, check out our website and to view past recordings of our events. And that is all I have for you. So I hope to see you all next time, whether at our external venues or here at the Mesa Lab. Again, thank you so much, and I appreciate you all. And thank you to our speakers.